You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech and Future Tech Health podcast. I have Dr. Jeffrey Karp. He's a professor of medicine at Brigham and Women's Hospital, part of Harvard Medical School. We're going to be talking about a pill that could reverse type 2 diabetes, which would be huge. Dr. Jeff's published over 125 peer-reviewed papers, with close to 20,000 citations. Amazing. He's given over 300 lectures. He issued over 100 pending patents. Tremendous background here. So, Jeff, thanks for coming. How you doing?
I'm great. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, I feel like a slacker now. I need to get going based on all the work you've done. Sheesh. Well, tell me a little bit about your background first, if you would. Then we'll get into this pill.
Absolutely. So I'm a chemical engineer by training. I did my my undergrad at McGill. I'm actually from a small town about an hour and a half northeast of Toronto called Peterborough. After McGill, I did my PhD in Toronto at University of Toronto, and then I did a postdoc at MIT in Bob Langer's lab from 2004 to 2007, and then I started as a faculty member at the Brigham and Women's Hospital through Harvard Medical School in July of 2007, and I've been there ever since. And I have a number of affiliations. I teach at MIT and do some committee work and things there through the mentor students through the Health Sciences and Technology program, and then I'm also an affiliate faculty at the Broad Institute and a principal faculty at the Harvard Stem Cell Institute.
Okay. So, tell me a little bit about the background of this pill. You know, from what I know, type 2 diabetes is just huge. It's going to be a monstrous drain on, the U.S. healthcare system and on healthcare systems worldwide. So what's the premise here, and how would you affect the condition?
Yeah, so diabetes is one of unbelievable to think of how much resources are put into treating patients who have diabetes, and this project began a number of years ago when a bariatric surgeon at my institution at the Brigham, Ali Tavakoli, had an idea, and about, I forget exactly the time, but maybe about in the last 10 or 15 years ago or so, there was this really remarkable discovery from a surgery that performed for obesity. And so a type of bariatric surgery called gastric bypass, where essentially you reroute the gut, so food will never pass through your stomach again. And this has been a very effective treatment for obesity. And many patients who are obese also have type 2 diabetes. And the remarkable finding was that the patients who had the type 2 diabetes, who had the gastric bypass procedure, a huge percentage of them did not require taking any medications to manage their diabetes immediately after the procedure. They didn't even have to wait for the weight to come down. This was just like a remarkable change in their disease. And so there was a society for bariatric surgery actually changed their name to the Society for Metabolic and Bariatric Surgery because of this discovery. And there's been multiple papers, including in New England Journal of Medicine and others that support this really exciting discovery. And so Dr. Tavakoli was right in the thick of it, being a bariatric surgeon, and he has a basic research lab dedicated to trying to understand how the mechanism behind, how this works. And so he was interested in seeing if there was a way to do this more minimally invasively, because bariatric surgery is just so invasive, to reroute your gut, and then, even like psychologically, food will never go past your stomach. It's a lot to stomach, if you will. And so there's a lot of side effects, and very few, you have to have a very high BMI to qualify for this procedure. So most people who could benefit actually don't qualify. And even if you do qualify, the side effects are just so severe that, a lot of people don't go through with it. And so he was interested in thinking about, is it possible to try to achieve the same response in a more minimally invasive way? And maybe, is it possible to develop a pill that you could swallow that could kind of do something similar? And so he went and spoke to Dr. Fred Schoen at the Brigham, who's a vice chair of pathology, and I've known Dr. Schoen for a while, and so he connected both of us, and we started talking, and that really led to this collaboration to develop a more minimally invasive way to treat type 2 diabetes through a very similar principle through which this gastric bypass procedure works.
Well, what do you think is I'll ask you, what do you think the mechanism is? But before that, what changes? Is it that the person's blood sugars are in control all of a sudden? Is it that, is there some other effect? How do you know that the diabetes has been mitigated? Do they not need to take insulin? What happens?
Exactly. Yeah. So there's a dramatic drop in the requirements for taking medications to manage glucose levels. And so they basically just start dropping immediately after these surgeries are performed. Yeah.
So when you do gastric bypass, the food comes in, but it doesn't go into the stomach at all, right? There's no smaller pseudo stomach that's made, or does it just start going to the the small intestine?
Yeah, so essentially, kind of simply stated, what happens is the gut is rerouted, so the stomach is still there and the stomach is still attached, but there's actually just nothing going into the stomach. And so what happens is that any food that you eat will bypass the stomach and essentially enter, instead of going through the stomach, it enters the kind of later part of the GI tract, kind of, down in deep kind of into the duodenum. And so the stomach is still there, and it's still active, but there's just no food that will ever contact it again. And so really what's happening is that you're isolating the contact of nutrients with the stomach and the first part of the duodenum, which is the part of the intestine, just right when you exit the stomach. And so what we did is we developed a pill that you could swallow that would provide a temporary coating on the exact same region that you isolate with gastric bypass procedures. And that coating is impermeable to nutrients, so it actually blocks nutrient absorption just in the first part of the GI tract. The nutrients can still be absorbed kind of later down, but just can't be absorbed in that region. And so we've done a series of experiments, many experiments, and demonstrated that we can significantly alter the ability to absorb glucose. And essentially we see about a 45 to 50% reduction in the glucose that we're able to detect in the blood when we pre-administer this pill that we've created.
So what's missing out on the digestive process when you bypass the stomach? So you're going right into you said the duodenum?
Yeah.
What would typically happen in the stomach? Like how does the body still process food if you're missing out on the stomach acid churning digestive part?
Sure. Yeah. So there's as you've highlighted, there's lots of enzymes that are present in the stomach, and a lot of it's a very dynamic environment. So you're kind of breaking down a lot of the foods into soluble forms that could then be digested. And so if you bypass the stomach, then you reduce the amount of nutrients essentially that can be absorbed. And this is one of the ways that gastric bypass procedures are able to treat obesity. Is that and then there's also a component where you end up being a little less hungry because of this, but you actually end up not being able to absorb as many calories, kind of simply stated. Now, nutrients can still be absorbed in the GI tract, but you just don't have the same efficiency as you would if the stomach was there.
Well, there are certain classes of nutrients that appear not to be digested. Like, it may be gross, but has anyone taken fecal samples from people with gastric bypass and profiled what the feces look like, what's the composition versus someone that has a regular digestive pathway?
Yeah, no, I think these studies have been done. I haven't gone through those specific studies in detail, but I'm sure my collaborator, Dr. Tavakoli, is familiar with those types of studies. I think, getting back to the mechanism question, it's interesting because the mechanism is not really fully defined. How gastric bypass procedure is how it can actually work to treat type 2 diabetes. But we do know, there's a lot of different things that can be at play. One is if you delay nutrient absorption kind of further down the GI tract, you start to see incretins like GLP-1 and GLP-2 start to be secreted, and that can have a positive benefit as well. And there's some biology that's happening in the first part of the GI tract that appears to be a bit out of whack. There's sweet taste receptors that exist there, and other types of receptors that on the surface of cells, and there could be and a lot of this is kind of speculative right now, just because the biology is being worked out. But we think that there's some kind of irregular biology happening in the first part of the GI tract, and that if you can isolate that with gastric bypass procedure, that this can actually help. And so what we've done is we actually created a pill that you could take, right before a meal or 2 or 3 hours before a meal, for example. And what this does is it forms a transient coating, and that can limit nutrient absorption. And then it's a very safe material that we've developed that can then just transit through the GI tract. It's not absorbed, and then it can just be excreted.
Oh, so I'd be able to take this pill and then eat, theoretically, a piece of chocolate cake, and it probably wouldn't affect me adversely, blood sugar-wise, let's say, or otherwise?
Yeah, so I think, that's the concept, that you would take it before a meal. We'd be able to significantly limit the contact of nutrients with the proximal or, first part of the GI tract, and that this would then replicate the beneficial effects of gastric bypass procedures on type 2 diabetics.
But how do you know that this would nullify the action of the stomach portion? What if it nullifies the stomach and a large part of the small intestine function, and therefore so little nutrients are involved, or such a skewed profile of them as to cause problems for a patient? How do you know that this emulates bypass?
Yeah, so we actually have some other kind of data points from other groups who have been developing various technologies. There's a company called GI Dynamics that has an endoluminal sleeve that they endoscopically place into the distal part of the stomach, and then it unfolds 60 centimeters into the duodenum. And so in that case, the stomach is still functional, the food still contacts the stomach, but you just essentially are isolating 60 centimeters of duodenum. And they were able to mimic many of the beneficial effects of gastric bypass procedures on type 2 diabetics. They ran into some challenges which they're trying to work out right now, because the system is anchored into the stomach. The stomach's very dynamic, and the anchor started kind of shifting around, so they ran into complications with how that device kind of stays in place. And so, they achieved, I believe it was a 1-year approval to be placed into patients for 1 year, but then they ran into some complications, and so now they're, I think, in the process of kind of iterating their technology. But I think the point here is that they've demonstrated, their technology supports this idea that if you don't have to isolate the stomach, you just have to isolate a segment of the duodenum. And so what we can do with our pill is we can design it so that it will selectively open and release the contents into the duodenum so that it doesn't contact the stomach. And then we can form our very thin mucoadhesive coating that can be that can help reduce nutrient absorption in that same region of the GI tract.
I've spoken to another company, I don't remember their name, but they were talking about gastric bypass. They had thought that it's because of the microbial constituent of the stomach and of the small intestine that they gave the benefits of bypass. So when you eat food that goes to the stomach, essentially it becomes an aerobic environment, anaerobic environment pretty quickly. No oxygen. But they said when a bypass was done, it appeared that oxygen was preserved and carried through to the small intestine, and therefore it changed the microbial constituent of the bacteria there. Are you looking all at the gut bacteria and see how they're affected by this coating?
Yeah, so we've started to look into that. I think clearly the field of gut microbiota is really exciting, and a lot of resources are being put into that space, both on the academic side as well as the clinical side. I think there's we're really just kind of at the beginning of that field and trying to understand how the microbes in the gut actually play a part in our physiology and in disease states. I think it may be a little too early right now to be able to have anything conclusive that we can say, although we do know that it's extremely active and it seems to be involved in lots and lots of different biological processes, and there's a lot of communications with the immune system and with the epithelium of the intestine. So there's likely something there, but I think it's probably just a little too early to be able to conclusively say that microbes have a very specific role. But I think it's an intriguing hypothesis, and over time we'll definitely hear more about what's actually going on.
Well, what happens in a patient that gets gastric bypass? You said that their need for insulin, for instance, goes way down. Does that last for a while, or does that slowly taper off, and do they return to their diabetic state over time after the surgery?
Yeah, I think most patients it's a durable response, and so they some even venture to call it a cure for certain patients of their type 2 diabetes. There's patients who be taking 4 or 5 drugs to manage their type 2, and after the gastric bypass procedure, they haven't required taking any drugs for years. And so I think there's a spectrum of patients and responses, but the majority of patients have a very robust, durable response.
Yeah, in terms of this pill, I don't know, is there any worry that people would abuse it, in an attempt to, not just for diabetes, but they want to lose weight? So it's kind of like bulimia in a way, or, anorexia. You eat and you throw up with bulimia, but here you just take the pill before you eat every single time, and therefore you're not absorbing the nutrients. You eat what you want, but you're essentially undernourished because of the lack of nutrient absorption. Is there any worry there?
Well, I think that with any drug that you bring to market, there's always concern about how the drug is used and whether it can be misused. I think more of an issue is compliance and making sure people take their medications at the right time. And there's a bunch of apps and different strategies that are being developed now. In fact, there's a company, Proteus, which has really cool technology on a pill, which can potentially ping your cell phone and tell you, remind you to take the pill, and it if you take the pill, it knows. So there's a lot of really innovative technologies that are being developed for compliance, and I think that tends to be a bigger issue for most drugs, not all drugs clearly, but for most drugs rather than for misuse. And I think we're advancing this along a drug path. We believe that we're actually what we've developed is based on a drug that already exists on the market, which we were able to modify to get it to work for this purpose. It's actually a compound called sucralfate. It's been used in millions of patients for duodenal and gastric ulcers, and it selectively binds to the ulcers and has a number of beneficial effects. And patients take it for months, usually like a 1 gram pill, like 3-4 times a day. It's extremely safe and non-absorbed, and we just modified that the sucralfate with some very simple modifications so that it could coat healthy gut tissue, and that we could deliver it directly to the duodenum. And And, we're advancing this along a 505(b)(2) pathway through FDA, and so we're taking the drug route, which doesn't completely abolish the potential for misuse, but I think there's a lot less chance for misuse when you have a regulated drug that requires prescription from a doctor. But one other point I think may be important to mention is that we think that this material could also be used as a treatment for obesity and for weight loss. We've been taking a really close look at that. We think that type 2 diabetes is a much better application to go after early on, just based on the market and based on the need, and as well as the process to get it through clinical trials. But we are also very interested in exploring the opportunity of using this for weight loss. But we really see that as more of something that we'll go after in the future, because we're very focused right now on type 2 diabetes. Also, I will add that this material is very intriguing for drug delivery as well, because the material is a paste, and there's very few pastes in medicine outside of craniofacial or dental medicine. And so we're delivering like a thin adhesive coating to the GI tract that is really a paste consistency. So what that does is actually moves really slowly through the GI tract. And so we can incorporate all kinds of drugs into the material, and as it transits through the GI tract, it stays in close contact with the epithelium, and it can then release these drugs. And so we believe that we can enhance the delivery of many different types of drugs by keeping them in close contact with the intestine, for long periods of time, which has been a big challenge for the drug industry.
Well, that brings up a good question. How is this going to affect the delivery and absorption of other drugs that people take, especially with meals? That might be a consideration. If this slows their absorption or changes the profile, or if a certain drug someone takes is normally absorbed, let's say, quickly in the stomach, but now slowly throughout the whole digestive system, I would think that would change the effects of that drug in them dramatically.
Yeah, well, there a pretty simple way around that, which is people can take their drugs before they take. So, for example, you could take your medications during times of the day that are separate from when you would take this pill that we're developing. And so the idea is that you could take meds a few hours before, a couple hours before you would take this LUCI, we call it, luminal coating of the intestine, to reduce nutrient absorption. And so certainly it'd be important to time the medication appropriately, but we believe if you time it appropriately that you really shouldn't have any issues for that. And there's actually a lot of evidence in the literature to suggest that's the case.
What about tuning the coating so that it acts, further upstream or downstream, or acts more strongly or less strongly?
Absolutely, and this is something that we've thought a lot about, and we've developed some strategies to do it. We can place the material into a capsule and then have a coating on the capsule, which is pH responsive, and there's a material called Udragite, which is very commonly used in pharma products to deliver drugs directly to the colon or to the duodenum or to other places in the GI tract. And so we can leverage materials that already exist within other types of pills and capsules, and essentially just combine it with our agent, so we can deliver directly to the duodenum if we want, or we could deliver directly to the colon. So we can control and target this material appropriately.
I would think that you'd have to look at how the nutrient absorption profile changes, what's absorbed, what's not, selectively, and then you'd be able to tune this and make it a lot more effective or a lot more selective in certain cases for people.
Exactly, yes, and that's one of the things that we are looking into as we plan the clinical development pathway for this drug.
Well, like a whole other idea would be, what about people that have gluten intolerance or sensitivity or other allergies? Perhaps you could tune this so that they'd be less prone to absorb whatever causes them problems when they have those foods, and therefore they'd be more protected and less likely to have adverse reactions because of this coating. It's a whole other area.
Absolutely, yeah. And in fact, I actually have celiac disease, so I have a gluten intolerance, and your question is something I've been thinking about as well. And we've spoken to some food allergy experts about the potential of using this, and we think there's definitely some opportunities here. I think what will really depend on is how severe someone's allergy is. And there's actually a lot of food allergies where there's a certain threshold. People can have small amounts of certain things, but if they have a larger amount, then they have a reaction. And we think for cases like that, we might be able to reduce the antigens that are causing these, immune responses. We may be able to reduce them just enough so that, people may be able to enjoy certain foods and not have to worry about having a reaction.
Yeah, a lot of possibilities. So where are you at with the approval process? Like, what are the steps ahead of you in order to get this approved by FDA?
Yeah, so we've licensed the technology into the company, which is called Ultrix Bio. We're based in Cambridge, near Kendall Square, within an incubator called Nest Bio. We've been working very closely with a clinical trial group to draft the plans to move this into trials. And so that's coming along really well, and we have our plans almost fully developed. We've also been working with manufacturers to develop an in-depth manufacturing plan. And we've been working very closely with patent lawyers to make sure that we maintain a very strong blocking position with freedom to operate. And so we just opened a convertible note for the company just a few weeks ago, and we've been raising money, and we're in the process of moving things full speed ahead. We're in the process of starting to hire full-time employees, and we have a really exceptional CEO, Nancy Briefs, who I've known for quite some time, probably over 10 years, and she has really deep experience in the in the medtech biotech industry. She's been CEO of many companies, many successful exits, and just a really wonderful person to work with. And so we're moving this full speed ahead.
What's going to be your model? Do you have to test this in mice, for instance, or because there's a similar substance that has proven to be safe, does that give you any fast track to test this in people first? Yeah,
so because we're basing this on a drug that already exists, and the modifications we're making are very, very minimal, we believe we're in a good position to accelerate through clinical development. I think, our path is shorter because we're advancing through this 505(b)(2) path. We think that we can get to, once we have the right funding in place, within about 4.5 years, we can get all the way to the end of phase 2. And so that's currently where we're headed.
Excellent. Well, Jeff, what's the best way for people to get in touch or to ask questions? What are some resources for them?
Yeah, I would encourage people to check out the website, Ultrix Bio, and we'll be constantly updating the information there, and as we build the team and hit milestones, and we'll also have an email contact there if people want to ask questions or want to be added to our database so we can keep people posted with our clinical development plans and also potential to participate in trials.
Well, very good. Well, Jeff, thanks for coming on the podcast. It's been a really interesting call.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, this has been great.
You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you.